Hello folks, and welcome to our lecture on audience analysis. As we begin this lecture, it will serve as our transition from focusing on informative speeches to persuasive speeches. Remember, the informative speeches placed you in a position as a teacher, where persuasion speeches are going to place you in the position as an advocate. In this position, one of the first things to begin understanding is how to analyze your audiences in order to tailor your presentation to your target audience. In this lecture, we will be covering quite a few subjects in relation to audience analysis. We will begin with a basic understanding of audience-centeredness and analysis. We will then move on to situational audience analysis, demographic audience analysis, knowledge analysis, the psychology of the audience, and we will close with how to begin adapting to your audience. Keep in mind, as we are focused on analyzing these differing perspectives, they in many ways also tend to overlap some. So the lines between the analysis groups is not always clear-cut. So let us begin with our first main point, audience-centeredness and understanding what audience analysis is. Audience-centeredness is the concept of keeping your audience foremost in mind during the creation and presentation of your speeches. Remember, the focus of a presentation is not you, it is them, and therefore your speeches are to be developed with your audience at the center. Because of this, it is imperative you have a general understanding of who your audience is so you can best develop your speech with them in mind. When we mention audience, we are generally referring to three main audience types. There are captive audiences, which refer to an audience that is generally required to be in attendance. There are also voluntary audiences, who choose to be there and tend to be easier to address. And then there are mixed audiences, which is a combination of the other two. Given that this course is often a college-level class, most of the time you are going to have a mixed audience. Once you understand the type of audience you are addressing, it is important to focus on audience-centeredness, implementing 5 general rules. First, always speak on your subject as it applies to your audience, not as it applies to you, preparing the message with your specific audience in mind. Second, speak to them based on their interests, not yours. Speak as if you are concerned for them and you are interested in who they are and have their interest in mind. Third, portray yourself as honest and sincere by mentioning your audience in some favorable way. Refrain from openly criticizing them, but find something among them which you can share as an appreciation for, and in this way win over their hearts. Fourth, always find ways to make the audience a part of the actual speech. Find some way to make them aware of who they are by calling on them to raise their hands in response, perhaps using an audience member to demonstrate a point. And lastly, make an effort to downplay yourself and present yourself in a modest, humble way. Do not portray yourself as somehow superior or better. This will lead to antagonization, which will cause your people to ignore your message. Presenting yourself as humble will create a feeling of goodwill between you and your audience. Now that we have a basic understanding of audience-centeredness, let us briefly cover the idea of audience analysis. This practice refers to the examining of a group by both demographic characteristics as well as psychological traits. The terms demographic and psychological are general terms which encompass the type analyses we will go over. When we are analyzing the audience, we tend to use 3 main paradigms: direct observation, inferences, and data collection. Direct observation is through the 5 senses, experience and observance of the peoples. Inferences refer to reasonable and logical assumptions or judgments based on available evidence. And data collection is the use of either statistical data or questionnaires to gather information. When gathering data from analyzing the audience, these tend to be the 3 main ways information is collected. Now that we have a general understanding about audience-centeredness and audience analysis, let us move on to our first form of analysis, which is situational analysis. This is a focus on situational factors such as the size of the audience, the general disposition they may have towards the topic and speaker, and the occasion for the presentation. The size of the audience is taken into consideration because it influences the language, appeals, and visual aids you will use during a speech. The general rule regarding audience size is that the bigger the audience, the more formal your speech is to be. The physical setting is also observed because the setting affects the reaction of the audience. If the speaker has the opportunity to control the environment, they should make use of it to the best of their ability. For example, if the presenter has control over the seating arrangements, they will want to align them close together, only setting up enough for the number of audience members. This will ensure that the audience will sit together, not leaving any space and gaps, which will allow for the audience to influence their neighbors' reactions. Temperature control is another setting you can use if you have control. If you are able to set the room temperature, it is a good idea to set it between 68 to 70 degrees, which is a very comfortable temperature. There are many other ways to use the physical setting to your advantage, but this will depend on the type of setting you are presenting in. Next is the disposition the audience may have towards your topic. This is analyzed observing their interest, knowledge, and attitude towards the subject. The audience desires to listen to something which interests them, so it is important that the speaker finds a way to relate the topic to the interest of the listeners. In regard to knowledge, most audiences are interested in things they know at least a little about, so it is important you observe and share general knowledge they may know on the topic to make them feel connected. Lastly, the speaker must observe the general attitude that people may have towards the topic. Will they generally have a favorable or opposing attitude? This will also influence how you approach the topic, since the general desire for the speaker is to end with their speech being desirable. Connected to the disposition towards the topic is the disposition towards the speaker. This is an observation of how the audience perceives the presenter and if their perception is negative, positive, or neutral. One of the main rules to abide by as the speaker is to find ways to express you have the audience's best interest at heart. This will generally garner a positive response from the listeners even if they may disagree with your topic. Lastly, there is the disposition towards the occasion. The occasion heavily influences the tone of the presentation, and therefore the emotional or psychological state of the audience. For example, the audience's state at a funeral would not generally be the same as at a business meeting. Or the audience's state of mind at a wedding would not be the same as their state at a graduation ceremony. Now that we have covered situational analysis, let us move on to our next main point over demographic audience analysis. This form of analysis is focused on the outward characteristics and classifications of the audience. This tends to make use of stereotyping, which is the practice of generalizing information or characteristics about groups. It is important to make a distinction between the general term of stereotyping and the negative term of stereotyping. The general term is a broad view, and is often associated with observing general patterns and characteristics which can be measured. The negative form of stereotyping has to deal with what is referred to as totalizing. This is the taking of a specific characteristic from a group or people and making that the totality of that person or group. This is the form of stereotyping we should keep away from. The first demographic we will approach is age. The general age of your audience is a determining factor on the disposition of your topic and possibly the speaker. Age is a major factor that influences the outlook and worldview of a person. Not every generation thinks alike. One thing to keep in mind is that there are generational overlaps which are new to our culture. We have people living longer and interacting with a very young generation. The older generations grew up in a culture concerned with family matters and households. The younger generation grows up focusing on career paths and individuality. Next, we have the concept of gender. Keep in mind that gender practices and attitudes differ between men and women. There are biological, cultural, and psychological differences between the sexes. In this case, we are more concerned about the communication patterns between the two. For example, notable communication expert Barbara Tucker defines the differences as inductive style and deductive style. She notes that women generally communicate using inductive style. They focus on giving more details as they move towards a conclusion. They tend to listen better, interrupt less, collaborate more and give more praise when communicating. Men on the other hand communicate more deductively. That is, they generally are more direct, clearly stating the point, limiting details, asking less questions and qualifying what they say. The next characteristic is sexual orientation. This characteristic is generally perceived differently based on the cultural background of your audience. It is important that you know the cultural attitudes regarding sexual orientation to better approach them. Next there is racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. These three are bound together because they overlap one another and are generally difficult to separate when approaching analysis. Keep in mind that we are a multi-racial and ethnic culture, so there are lots of overlaps in our country. There are times when you may analyze an audience that is more homogeneous, that is, they are very similar in their characteristics. Whichever the group, you must analyze the best way to approach them with your topic and find ways to relate to them. Moving on, we have group membership. These are the affiliations people have towards groups. For example, occupations, social positions, education level, social standing, gender, religion, etc. Most people belong to several types of groups that they are affiliated with, and these groups influence their perceptions and worldview. Next, We have region. This is analyzed in both country regions and residential regions. Country regions in our culture refer to general locations such as the West Coast, East Coast, the South, and the Midwest. Many times, these region types can give a general understanding of the people groups, as the lifestyles and values may be similar. Residential regions, on the other hand, refer to urban areas, suburbs, and rural regions. People's everyday lifestyle is heavily influenced by the residential region they were raised in. Our next characteristic is religion. This is often associated by region, as region plays an influence on one's religious upbringing. Religion is a major influence on the value system of your audience and plays a major role on their perceptions of ethics. It is important to remember there are a large range of faiths, and even those dominant religions have many denominations. For example, Christianity is one of the largest religions in the world, but there are over 2,000 denominations worldwide, and not all agree to the same doctrinal practices. There is also a distinction between affiliation and commitment. Religious affiliations refer to having a loose connection to a religious group. This is usually observed by adhering to some practices but not necessarily making it part of one's everyday life. Commitment, on the other hand, is observed in adhering to the rules, norms, and doctrinal beliefs in one's daily life. And religion is often the major worldview they perceive reality through. Moving to the next characteristic, we have occupation. People often choose occupations which reflect their values, interests, and abilities. We also tend to associate with people groups who are closely associated with your occupation. Closely associated with occupation is education, our next characteristic. We often associate educational levels with intelligence levels, and we make general assumptions about others based on their educational level. Overlapping with occupation and educational levels is socio-economic level. This is the general standing people have in society based on their economic level. In our culture, the socio-economic level of people is very fluid and not necessarily permanent. For example, since we live in a capitalist society, we focus on the use of the free market. This allows people to move up and down in regard to their socio-economic level. For example, someone can be born into a level of poverty, yet move up into a level of wealth, and vice versa. And our last characteristic in demographic analysis is family status. The status of family differs among our diverse population. We have married, single, divorced, families with children, no children, multi-generational households, and so on. All of these factors influence the worldview of audience members and what they place for their responsibilities, priorities, and decision-making. Now that we have covered the demographic audience analysis, let us move on to knowledge analysis. This is a rather short analysis but a very important one. The speaker must make efforts to analyze the general amount of information the audience would know of their topic. I have observed students who will present a persuasion speech on a controversial topic in their eyes, and yet the audience had no clue about what the subject was and therefore cared little about what was being presented. The speaker must ensure that the audience has at least some basic knowledge on the subject at hand, especially when it comes to persuasion speeches. Knowledge analysis is also important because the speaker must ensure that the audience is not more knowledgeable on the subject than they are. It can be that you make an assumption they know very little of your subject, and if they know more, you may be presenting an elementary speech to an already knowledgeable audience. After gaining a basic understanding of audience-centeredness in analysis, we will move on to our next main point of understanding the psychology of the audience. Understanding the psychological state of the audience is not something we can generally measure, but it is important to understand some of the main psychological characteristics of your audience when creating your presentations. As we approach some of these psychographic characteristics, we are observing four elements: attitudes, beliefs, values, and needs of the audience. Let us first examine attitudes. These are learned dispositions people hold towards other people, ideas, objects, and so on. Our attitudes come by way of our experiences, information, and interactions, and they often lead to actions which in turn strengthen those attitudes. Attitudes are somewhat unstable, in that they can change easily at times based on new experiences or information. Beliefs are what we would consider our principles and views that we hold to be true. They influence how we respond to the world as we interact. Beliefs are more durable than attitudes because they do not hinge on issues but rather on ideas. For example, when you look at almost all historic civilizations, almost all of them develop their belief systems on forms of religion, and religions focus on ideas and not issues. Beliefs have four main characteristics which make them stable and difficult to change. First, they are stable because they are grounded in a value system. And the longer we hold on to them, the more stable they become. Second, they take a central part of our identity and self-concept, and make up a portion of how we identify ourselves. Third, they are salient, and we consider them extremely important enough to keep them at the forefront of our mind. And fourth, they are strengthened as we engage in activities or thoughts that support them, and we purposely look for activities which strengthen them. Overlapping beliefs, we also have values. Values are what guide our beliefs and regulate our attitudes. They are often connected to our goals we consider important or desirable and are often found in representations such as materialism, nostalgia, or physical pleasure. Lastly, we have needs. These are considered important deficiencies which we are motivated to fulfill. The most notable theory and model used to explain needs is known as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which portrays the needs of a person starting at a foundation and moving upwards as those bottom needs are met. For example, the very bottom and foundation of our needs are the physiological needs that must be met, that is, we need food, water and sleep. Once those needs are met, then we can advance onto our need for safety, which is security, protection, and resources. After our safety needs are met, we can then focus on our love needs, which would entail friendships, family, and romance. When our need for love is met, we can advance on to meeting our esteem needs, which would consist of building confidence, achievements, and garnering respect. And once those needs are achieved, we can focus on the final stage, which is self-actualization. This is a focus on morality, problem-solving, and creativity. It is important to remember that as we analyze our audience, we must take into account their psychological state as well by reminding ourselves that they are filtering our presentation through the lenses of their attitudes, beliefs, values, and needs. Moving on to our last main point, we will end with 3 ways to begin adapting to your audience. The first thing to consider is to adapt to your audience before your actual speech by assessing how your audience is likely to respond, avoid negative stereotyping, and avoid presenting yourself as if you are above them. Make it a habit to perceive things from their perspective rather than your own. The second way is to focus on adapting to your audience during your speech. Begin to make a habit of observing their feedback and adjusting your delivery method, style, or information to gain and keep their interest. And lastly, be sure to actually converse with the audience. Speak to them as if they have just asked you a question and you are responding to them so that you create a conversation-like quality in your presentation. Remember, the goal is to make them feel a part of the speech, as if it was made for them. And with that, we will wrap up this lecture over audience analysis. Remember, you are to practice audience-centeredness by keeping the audience as the center of your speech from its creation to its ending. To do this, you must make a practice of analyzing your audience by way of the situation, demographics, and knowledge, understanding that they are filtering your speech through their attitudes, beliefs, values, and needs. Making a habit of these practices will help ensure that your speech is not only understood by the audience, but it will make them feel as if you made this specifically for them.